The ridge above Arroyo Seco had seen bad cabins before. Lean shacks, crooked sheds, a few winter homes so poorly chinked that you could watch candlelight leak through the walls. But in October of 1888, the settlement saw something stranger than bad carpentry. It saw a house that looked as if someone had pressed the earth itself into the shape of a shelter. There were no clean courses of pine logs, no proud corner joints, no squared beams announcing that a proper builder had been there. Instead, a black basalt foundation climbed 3 feet out of the frozen ground, and above it rose walls almost 2 feet thick, made from clay, sand, chopped rye straw, and lime. The walls curved slightly under the hand, not because they were weak, because no sawmill had made them. They had been packed, pressed, and smoothed by human palms. To the people of the San Luis Valley, who trusted timber the way sailors trusted rope, it looked like a mistake with a roof on it. Silas Marrow, the best carpenter within 40 miles, did not whisper his judgment. He said the wall would belly out. He said the spring thaw would lift the clay from the stone like wet dough sliding off a board. He said the first heavy snow would make the rafters bite into that mud and crush the whole thing before morning. And because Silas had built the church frame, the grain store, the schoolhouse, and half the cabins in the valley, people believed him. Then the cold came, alley under a lid of ice fog. At noon, the thermometer still hung below -20. Inside the finest log houses, frost grew in the corners. Blankets stiffened where they touched the walls. Men fed stoves until the iron glowed, and still their children woke with white breath hanging over their beds. But the strange earthen house on the south slope burned almost no wood. A thin thread of smoke rose from its chimney in the morning, another at dusk. Then nothing. And inside, Luka Marinovich and his wife Mara sat beside warm walls while the valley's best-built cabins froze from the inside out. That was the question nobody in Arroyo Seco could answer. How could a house made from dirt hold warmth better than a house made from timber? The answer was not luck. It was not foreign magic. It was a piece of building physics most of the valley had never been taught. A wall can be more than a wall. It can be a memory device. It can collect the sun at noon, hide that heat inside its own weight, and give it back slowly after midnight, when every ordinary wall has already gone cold. Luka Marinovich was not a carpenter. He had crossed the ocean with no talent for cutting dovetails, no instinct for grading planks, and no patience for the frontier habit of solving every winter problem with another load of firewood. In the Austrian port towns along the Dalmatian coast, he had worked as a lime burner and oven mason, not the straight line of boards. It was the slow behavior of mineral things. He knew how limestone changed under fire. He knew how clay shrank if it dried too fast. He knew why an oven needed mass, not just flame. He knew that a short, fierce burn could heat a chamber of brick so deeply that bread baked long after the fire had been raked away. That was the education he carried into Colorado. Stone, lime, clay, fire, and time. When Luca and Mara arrived in the San Luis Valley, they did what every newcomer was told to do. They bought lumber they could barely afford, accepted help from neighbors, and built a fast plank cabin to survive their first winter. It nearly broke them. The stove was always hungry. If Luca slept too long, the room died before dawn. The ceiling above the stove felt almost hot, while the floor stayed cruelly cold. Mara learned to keep her boots under the blanket, or they would freeze stiff by morning. A pan of dishwater left near the wall would skin over with ice. At supper, frost appeared along the seams of the planks in sharp white lines, as if the house were being cut open by the weather. Worst of all was the way the heat vanished. A fire could make the room harsh for an hour, too bright, too dry, too hot near the iron stove. But when the flames sank, the warmth disappeared, as if it had never belonged to the room at all. The house did not store comfort. It merely borrowed it. So Luca watched. He watched the log cabins of men richer than himself. He watched Silas Merrow's own house, built with tight joints and clean work, still sweating frost where warm indoor air met cold wood. He watched families drag beds closer to stoves, then closer again. He watched women wipe ice from window panes every morning, only to see it bloom again by nightfall. Then he watched the stones. On clear winter afternoons, the dark basalt outcrops along the ridge would drink in the low sun. By evening, when the air had sharpened and the snow crust had begun to squeak underfoot, those stones still held a dull warmth. Not much, not enough to melt the world, but enough that a bare hand could feel the difference between stone that had faced the sun and stone that had sat in shadow. That was when Luca understood his mistake. Kind of shelter. A frontier cabin was a box against the cold. Better carpentry made a better box, but it was still a box. It tried to slow the escape of heat. It did not know how to keep it. What Luca needed was not a stronger box. He needed a kiln turned inside out. The next summer, while other men cut timber, Luca began collecting stone. He walked the arroyo bed before breakfast, choosing basalt blocks with flat shoulders and rough faces. He hauled them up the slope on a drag sled behind his mule. For 3 weeks, his work looked sensible enough. Even Silas Merrow gave a grudging nod when he saw the trench Luca had dug below frost depth, the rubble drain packed beneath it, and the heavy stone footing rising above the splash line. Drain packed beneath it, and the heavy stone footing rising above the splash line. "A dry foundation is never foolish," Silas said. Then Luca stopped building like a respectable man. He dug clay. He mixed it with sand. He chopped straw into it. He added slaked lime in careful amounts, not enough to turn it brittle, just enough to help the weathered skin resist rain. Then he and Mara stepped barefoot into the mixing pit and began treading the mass until it became heavy, fibrous, and alive under their feet. Children came first to laugh. Then their parents came to stare. There were no forms, no frame, no studs, no sheathing. Luca carried the mixture in great forked loads and packed it directly onto the basalt base. He built in lifts, each one no higher than his thigh, forcing the wet earth into the layer below with both hands. He pressed out air pockets. He folded the edges inward. He shaped corners as if he were shaping the shoulder of an oven. The wall did not rise quickly. That was part of the scandal. A log wall could climb in a day. Luca's wall had to rest. It had to stiffen. It had to surrender some water before the next lift could bear on it. To men who measured progress in the number of logs stacked before sunset, this looked like failure pretending to be patience. Silas visited on a clear September afternoon. He walked the perimeter without greeting Luca. He pushed his thumb against a drying section of wall. He looked at the deep south windows Luca had framed into the thick clay. Then at the dark flagstone floor inside. Then at the clay bench rising around the small masonry heater in the center of the room. His face tightened. "Luca," he said, "I will tell you plainly. You understand stone, I grant you that. But this is not a chimney. This is a house." Luca kept his hands in the mud. Silas pointed at the wall. "That material belongs underfoot, not over a family's head. When the thaw comes, the ground will move. When the roof loads, the wall will spread. And if it does not spread, it will wick water from below until it crumbles from within." The workers nearby fell quiet. Silas lowered his voice, but not enough. "You are building a grave with windows." Mara, standing beside the mixing pit, went still. Luca looked at the stone plinth, then at the wet wall, then at the carpenter. "The stone is for the water," he said. "The earth is for the heat." Silas gave a dry laugh. "Heat does not live in mud." Luca picked up another mass of clay and straw and pressed it onto the wall. "It does if you teach the mud when to remember." By late October, the house was enclosed. The roof was lower than most cabins, with broad eaves to shield the walls from summer storms. The south windows sat deep in the earthen face, not large by modern standards, but large enough to admit the low winter sun. The north wall had only two small openings. The floor was black flagstone over packed earth. At the center stood Luca's masonry heater, a squat core of brick, clay, and stone with a winding flue path that forced hot gases to spend their heat before reaching the chimney. People disliked the house because it looked poor. That was the first mistake. The house was not poor. It was disciplined. Every part had a job. The stone foundation lifted the clay away from ground moisture. The lime-washed skin shed rain. The thick walls slowed temperature swings. The dark floor collected sunlight. The masonry heater burned small loads hot instead of wasting wood in a long, smoky smolder. The south face invited winter sun in. The roof eaves kept the higher summer sun out. But none of that was obvious from the road. From the road, it was still just a mud house. Then January arrived like a verdict. The cold did not come as a storm. No heroic blizzard, no dramatic wall of snow. It came silently, the way true cold often does in mountain valleys. A layer of warmer air trapped the valley floor beneath it, and the cold settled like water in a basin. The first morning, the temperature was 12 below. By the third, it was 21 below. By the fifth, the valley had entered a stillness so complete that sound seemed to freeze before it traveled. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys. It crawled sideways, flattened by the inversion, then hung in blue sheets above the roofs. Inside the log houses, life narrowed to the stove. People stopped using back rooms. They stopped sitting near exterior walls. They stuffed rags into cracks that had not existed in November. They woke to find nail heads rimmed with frost and frost feathers climbing the inside corners. Silas Merrow's house, the pride of the settlement, held better than most. But it still lost. His wife wore a coat indoors. Their youngest slept in a chair near the stove because the bedroom wall had become too cold. Silas burned through wood so fast that he began splitting pieces meant for February. Each night he listened to his own house complain. Wood popped. Chinking cracked. The stove ticked like an angry clock. And always, beneath the noises, there was the thin, constant movement of air through places his hands had once believed were tight. A good carpenter knows the sound of failure when it enters a building. Freeze, Silas heard it everywhere. The accident happened the next afternoon. Silas and his apprentice, Tom Bell, were trying to clear snow from a shed roof before the weight brought it down. The cold had made every motion clumsy. Tom's mittens were stiff. The ladder rungs were glazed. The metal edge of a draw knife, left on a plank for only a moment, had become cold enough to burn. Tom slipped. He did not fall far, but he came down badly, catching the tool with the back of his hand. The cut opened across his knuckles, deep and ugly. Blood welled dark, then thickened almost immediately in the air. Silas knew what that meant. A bleeding hand in that cold was not a minor injury. It was a race. Their own house was too far. The nearest door was uphill. Luca's door. Silas did not have time for pride. He half-carried Tom through the hard snow and pounded on the thick wooden slab set into the whitewashed earth wall. When Luca opened it, warm air rolled out, not hot, not smoky, not sharp like stove heat. Warm, soft, steady, and impossible. Silas stepped inside and stopped. He had entered winter houses his whole life. He knew their pattern. Heat near the stove, cold at the wall, damp at the corners, smoke in the throat. This room broke the pattern. The air did not attack. It surrounded. Mara took Tom's hand, sat him near the masonry bench, and washed the wound with water drawn from a bucket on the floor. The bucket was not frozen. Silas stared at it. Then he looked at the walls. No frost, no wet corners, no bloom of ice around the windows, no draft lifting the flame of the lamp. The masonry heater was not roaring. Its firebox was dark. Luca had burned a small load that morning, and the burn was long finished. Yet the brick core still radiated warmth. More unsettling than that, all itself felt warm enough that Mara had hung a damp cloth near it to dry. Silas crossed the room slowly. He placed his palm against the earthen wall. He expected the old truth. An outside wall in January steals heat from the hand. Instead, the wall gave heat back. Not much, not like iron, not like flame, but like a living animal asleep under a blanket. Silas moved his hand to another place, then another. The wall was warmest where the afternoon sun had struck it hours earlier. He looked at Luca. "How much wood have you burned today?" "1 bundle in the morning," Luca said. "1 tonight if the sky stays closed." Silas turned toward the small wood stack beside the door. It was not large enough to heat a cabin through a week like this. He looked at the flagstone floor, still faintly warm where the sun had reached it through the south windows before the gray returned. He looked at the deep wall openings, the thick reveals, the small north windows, the heavy central heater. The insult he had given months earlier came back to him. Heat does not live in mud. But here it was, living there. The boy's hand was bandaged. Mara wrapped it cleanly and told Silas to keep him inside until the bleeding fully stopped. But Silas barely heard. He had found a contradiction too large to ignore. The next morning, he came back with a thermometer, a notebook, and no apology. Luca let him in. For 3 days, Silas measured everything he could think to measure. Outside temperature, inside temperature, wall temperature near the floor, wall temperature near the south window, temperature of the flagstone in sun and in shade, time of morning firing, time at which the heater surface peaked, time at which the south wall felt warmest after the sun had moved away. The numbers were not miraculous. That bothered him at first. The house was not breaking physics. It was obeying physics more completely than his cabins did. A log cabin slowed heat loss, but it stored little heat. Its walls were mostly cellulose and trapped air, useful for resistance, poor for memory. Warm them quickly, and they cooled quickly. Any gap between logs became a small chimney for the warmth to escape. Luca's walls were different. Clay, sand, lime, straw, and stone had weight. Enormous weight. A square foot of that wall contained far more thermal mass than a square foot of timber. It took a long time to warm, but once warmed, it gave that heat back slowly. The south windows supplied the charge. In winter, the sun traveled low across the southern sky, so its light reached deep into the room. It struck the dark stone floor, the clay bench, the interior face of the thick wall. Those surfaces absorbed heat during the day. The heat moved through the mass slowly. That delay, which a carpenter might mistake for sluggishness, was exactly the point. The house did not need its warmest surfaces at noon. It needed them after sunset. The thick earthen walls created a time lag. Gathered during the day arrived back at the room hours later, when the valley was darkest and coldest. The masonry heater added another storehouse, taking the fierce heat of a short burn and stretching it into a long release. Silas finally understood the trick. Luca had not built a better barrier. He had built a reservoir. That did not mean the house was perfect. Luca had to keep the walls dry. The lime wash mattered. The foundation mattered. The roof overhang mattered. Drainage mattered. Badly built earth walls could fail, just as Silas had warned. But this wall was not simply dirt. It was material arranged to solve a precise problem. By the end of the cold spell, people stopped laughing. They had seen too much. By the end of the cold spell, people stopped laughing. They had seen too much. Mara carried laundry without frost in the corners of her room. Tom Bell recovered with all his fingers. Luca's woodpile had barely shrunk. And Silas Marrow, who had once called the house a grave with windows, began telling men at the grain store that the grave was warmer than any parlor in the valley. The change did not happen all at once. Pride rarely collapses cleanly. It cracks first. In February, Silas asked Luca to show him the wall mix. In March, he asked about the roof-bearing plate. In April, he walked the property after snowmelt, inspecting the base of the walls for the slump he had predicted. He found none. The basalt had kept splash and groundwater away. The lime skin had shed the weather. The clay had dried hard, not like brick, but like a dense, continuous body. By May, a rancher named Elias Pritchard asked Luca whether a smaller version could be built for his widowed sister. By June, 2 families were digging south-facing foundations. By August, Silas was helping frame roofs for earth walls he would have condemned the year before. He did not become a different man. he became a better builder. That is harder. A different man can reject his old world and pretend he was never part of it. A better builder has to keep his skill, admit its limits, and add what the evidence has taught him. Luca never asked Silas to kneel before the mud wall. He asked him to touch it. That was enough. The principle inside that little Colorado house is still used today, though we give it cleaner names and model it with software. Thermal mass, passive solar gain, time lag, heat storage, solar orientation, moisture management, controlled ventilation, material coupling. But the heart of it is simple. Light becomes heat when a surface absorbs it. Mass stores that heat when it has enough weight to hold it. Time releases that heat when the room needs it most. And design decides whether the house wastes the gift or keeps it. Luca had learned this from ovens. The valley learned it from winter. There is a reason the story stays with people. It is not just because an expert was wrong. Experts are wrong every day. And it is not because a poor immigrant secretly knew more than everyone else. That is too small a lesson. The real lesson is sharper. A building does not become wise because it looks familiar. A method does not become foolish because it looks primitive. And comfort is not always won by burning more fuel. Sometimes the stronger answer is the slower one. The wall that waits, the stone that remembers, the room that does not fight the night, because it spent all afternoon preparing for it. Long after the firebox went dark, long after the smoke vanished from the chimney, Luca's walls were still giving back the day. In a valley where everyone else had tried to defeat winter with flame, one mud house survived by keeping a promise to the sun. Thank you for watching. If stories of forgotten practical intelligence matter to you, subscribe for more. Tell us in the comments, what old building method do you think modern homes should relearn? This story is a historically inspired reconstruction for educational storytelling. The named characters and specific events are fictionalized, while the building principles described are based on real passive solar and earthen construction concepts. Do not attempt structural or earthen building work without qualified professional guidance, local code review, and proper moisture, seismic, and safety design.